Let's start with just a moment of prayer. Let's pray. Holy gracious God, thank you for this day, for a beautiful day outside, for this opportunity to gather together as your people and to think together and pray together and be together around the question of how can we be your people more effectively and fruitfully in this place. Open our hearts and our minds. Help us to bring the best questions we have to bring and to share with one another openly and truly in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So, my name is Steve Ross. I'm a United Methodist pastor. I actually grew up at Monteville United Methodist Church. At church all my life. My mom still sits in the sanctuary at Monteville United Methodist Church every Sunday in that spot right there. Third pew on the right-hand end. And she sits there pretty much alone most Sundays. There are other people in the sanctuary, lots of them actually, but that pew is pretty much empty, or at least it appears to be that way to people who haven't been around a long time. What everybody else knows is that next to her is my dad, my grandfather, my grandmother, my aunts, uncles, cousins, right? Because they're all still there for her. In most of our churches, there are sanctuaries that are full of people who aren't here anymore. And what's funny is that a lot of times to a visitor it looks like we don't like each other because we're all spread out with big spaces in between. And that's because they can't see all the, a new person cannot see all those people who used to. She's a very outgoing and gregarious and welcoming person. As a matter of fact, there has been some stir in that congregation. A couple of years ago, they had a pastor who was very outward focused. Of course, the neighborhood around the church isn't very much at all like it was when I grew up there. And my mother would invite the homeless people in to sit in her pew with her, and that was a little bit upsetting to some people in the church. So she's very glad to have people join her, but most of the other people in church know that the pew is full already. So, yeah. So I want to give a little introduction because what I'm about to do with this is sort of like if you go into your doctor's office and they say, okay, I'm going to give you penicillin and here's how you take it. Okay, we're going to be talking about the medicine, but we haven't talked about the disease. So let me just do a little bit of introduction to why would this be even worth the trouble, what we're going to talk about. Why should I take the penicillin or drink the Kool-Aid, depending on how you feel about this stuff, right? And so here's why. I'm 62 years old. I've been a United Methodist all of my life except for 2 years when Joanna and I went to graduate school, my wife and I in Corvallis, and we went to a Disciples of Christ church for 2 years while I was learning how to be a wildlife biologist. Later became a United Methodist pastor. So growing up in the church, my folks, my whole family were every Sunday people. My mom sang in the choir. My dad taught an adult Bible study, during the Sunday school hour. My parents were on the trustees, the worship committee, the SPRC, all that stuff. I was on a finance committee when I was 15 years old at the church. Here's what I never, ever heard the whole time I was growing up in the Methodist church. Let's talk about why we're here. Right? If I had said to my mom, which by the way I never did, as a matter of fact when I was a pastor I would have parents who had junior high age boys ask me as their pastor, do you make your kids go to church with you, or did your parents make you go to church? Because 7th grade boys always raise that issue for their families. And my honest answer was, I don't really know if my folks made us go. It never really came up, right? We just all went. It never occurred. A rebellion for me in middle school and high school was, instead of sitting in the family pew, I sat in the back row with all my friends in the youth group, right? That was rebellion. So, but we never talked about why go to church. If I had said to my folks, why are we going to church? They would have said, because we're Methodists. That's what we do, right? If I had said, Mom, why does the worship committee do the things it do? Because that's what we do. She would not have been articulate about why, because she knew, and my dad knew, that to be God's people. You attended church on Sunday. You served on a committee when it was your turn. You gave some money to the church to make sure it was going. You participated in an adult Bible study. And to talk about why was not even a question that needed to be brought up. Here's the thing that we're dealing with now. You saw some of this morning from Rashinda. By the way, those statistics that the Pew Research Center got about how many people are Methodist, mainline Protestants, just remember that that's self-identification. So they ask people, what's your religious identity? And they say, I'm a Methodist. I used to go to the hospital and check the registration record twice a week as a pastor, and there it would say Methodists, and there would be 11 names there, and I would go, holy cow, I only know one of those people. And so I would go to the rooms, and I would be visiting with this 70-year-old person who was in the hospital for heart surgery, and I would say, I noticed you're a Methodist, I'm the Methodist pastor, and she said, oh yes, I was confirmed in Illinois when I was in 8th grade. And I've lived now in McMinnville or Philomath for 50 years, and I don't go to church and haven't that. But that person identified as a Methodist, right? Though nobody at the Methodist church knew them. I have a friend who's a Lutheran pastor in Dallas, Oregon, and he's also the fire department chaplain. He went out on this call to a house where a guy had a heart attack, and the man passed away, and he's saying to the woman, is there anybody I can call, a friend or your pastor? She said, you could call my pastor. He said, who is that? She said, the Lutheran pastor. He said, that's me. And I've been the pastor in Dallas, Oregon for 11 years. So those statistics include all those people who say, I'm a Methodist that haven't been in church in 23 years. Their children did not grow up in the church, right? So here's the problem that we face, or part of it. Rashinda had a series of questions up there in the sermon this morning, one of which was, who are we sent to make disciples of? Right? Who's our neighbor? And that's how you start to be intentional about being a church that reaches out to other people with the good news, is to ask, who has God sent us to? And what I can tell you is that though no one ever asked that question that way, nor could my parents have answered the question if they were asked that, or any of the people in their generation in the church, the answer was our children. The target of our discipling efforts when I was growing up in the church, and by the way, for 50 years before that, was our children. Why? Because other people went to other churches. Right? And I was taught, actually, it's bad to go steal people from other churches. That's just, they're Christians, let them be. That's their style, right? So our mission field was our children. So everything we know how to do to raise up Christians, and which, by the way, worked pretty well on me. I'm an excellent Christian, just in case you're wondering. Just like you are. It worked on me. And here's how it worked. I was delivered to be baptized when I was a tiny infant, and I was literally listed on what they called the cradle roll, right? Which hung on the wall in the nursery with the names of all the babies, right? And then I went to the preschool class and the K1 class and the 2-3 class and the 4-5 class and the middle school class and the senior high class. And I went to vacation Bible school every summer, and starting in 4th grade, I went to church camp every summer for a week. And then I went off to campus ministry while I was at college, and when I came back at 23 years old, I was ready to be a member, a full participant in the life of the church, which meant serving on a committee, going to worship on Sunday morning, giving money, right? When did I learn the stories of Jesus? When I was 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, right? When did I learn about Paul's missionary journeys? 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. When did I learn about David and Abraham in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade? By the time I'm sitting in the pew at 24 years old and the pastor is saying, take for example Jonah, I knew exactly what was being talked about, right? Here's the problem we have. If someone walks in your door who's 32 years old and has 2 little children, and you mention Jonah, they're going, is that the guy that went out of Egypt? Right? We're talking to people now who are the 3rd generation of people who have no church background. And if we like them and they seem young and nice people, what do we say to them at the end of the second Sunday they're here? Would you like to join the church and teach a Sunday school class? Since you got kids, right? And they're going, no, I don't, what do you mean? I came here looking for some kind of answer to some huge questions that I have. That I thought maybe, because I vaguely remember my grandmother, who was a church person, being brave in the face of life. And I'm looking for something now, and you're asking me to teach Sunday school or serve on a committee? I don't even know why I'm here really yet. Right? So our problem is that everything we know how to do to make disciples involves starting with them when they're babies. And we're encountering a mission field now full of people who are grown-ups. By the way, not only 30-year-olds, 60-year-olds. Who are for the first time in their lives beginning to ask the question of, wait a minute, how do I connect to the ground of being, or the purpose for everything, or the why for human life? For the first time, because they've been pretty well entertained until now. And we don't know how to talk to them. When they say to us, why would I be here? Why are you a Christian? We go, well, I go to church, and I've done consultations in about 50 churches where we go in, we interview a lot of people, and every one of those interviews that I've done, which is in the hundreds now, we start with this question: tell me a little bit of your spiritual journey. That's always the first question. Let me tell you what we get 99% of the time. I was raised in a Lutheran church in Billings. We moved here. My wife was a Methodist, so we started going to the Methodist church. I served on the trustees. I've been on the church council. I really like the men's group. Do you understand that's not a spiritual story? That's not a spiritual journey. That's a church story. And that somebody who doesn't know about church would go, okay, why? Okay. So I told you I was going to try and describe the disease that this is some of the medicine for, right? And here's how what we're going to talk about today is medicine for the disease that we don't know how to talk to people about why we're here. We know how to talk about what to do. We don't know how to talk about why. And the reason is we didn't need to. We talked about why, most of us, when we were 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years old. And the why is so deep inside of us, we don't even ask the question anymore. Churches that reach into their missional community and embrace people into the gospel, invite people powerfully to become disciples and start following Jesus, can talk about why. And as a matter of fact, they can talk about why not only as individuals, but they can say, this is why our church is here, right? This is why we exist here. And you can become part of that big why. But most of our churches don't have any place where that conversation is carried out. Our entire superstructure of church leadership is based on carrying out the programs, right? We get together not to talk about why, but to talk about how are we going to get this done? How are we going to have who's going to teach the Bible study class? Who's going to cook the breakfast? Those things have to be decided. Those things have to be done. You have to do something to reach people. But all we talk about is how to get those things done. That's management. And we get together and we do management. And every one of our committees is about how to do the stuff that we're doing, not about why. So we're going to talk today about thinking about being a church in a way that makes a core group of leaders gather around one reason to talk about why are we here, who are we sent to, and how are we going to reach them. That's a new thing for most of our churches to be doing. Last time we did that was in the 1850s. And I'm not saying there was no why. My parents, that was so apparent to them they couldn't talk about it like a fish talking about water. But that's not true anymore. We need to learn, again, how to talk about why. So that's what we're going to do today. Wow, how did I get there? So it turns out that vital congregations are characterized by these 5 things. Some of you may have heard of Bishop Schneese's book, The 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations. Notice he's talking about practices, right? Even he's not talking about why. Radical hospitality, passionate worship, external focus, mission, he calls it risky mission, intentional discipling process, and extravagant generosity. But I want to say there's two other things in my 30 years of studying vital congregations that they have in common. They also have flat and simple structures. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And they have flat and simple structures in order to make life easier for new people, but also because flat and simple structures convey the why of their existence a little bit easier. On the right, you'll see a diagram, and you can't read all the parts, can you? It doesn't matter, because even if you could read all the parts, you could probably not figure out how that church structure works. That is an actual United Methodist Church website's a particular church, Shady Grove. That's their actual structure diagram that's on their website so that apparently new people can figure out how their church works. Does that look simple to you? No. It's also not flat. So let me talk for a minute about, we're going to talk a little bit about flat and simple. We're also going to talk about what do we want to happen because they did their job. Okay? So when Joanne and I had two boys in high school, we have 3 sons, no daughters. When our oldest 2 were in high school, Joanne was teaching school full-time, I'm a pastor full-time. Life was chaotic. She decided they were old enough to make sure the garbage got out to the street before the garbage man came on Friday mornings, because week after week we go, oh shoot, right? Nobody got it out there in time. There goes the garbage man. So she sat Justin and Michael down on the couch and she said, you guys are responsible for getting the garbage cans out to the street on Friday morning before the garbage man comes. You can do it Thursday night, you can do it Friday morning before you go to school, but you guys need to, that's your job. Pretty clear statement of responsibility, right? What's the outcome that we want? Garbage out there in time, exactly right. So Friday came and went. Friday evening we got home from work and church and school, and guess what? Garbage cans hadn't gotten out to the street. Why not?
Beans thought the other one was...
Exactly right. Joanne said, what's the deal? And they both pointed at each other. It was his turn this week, right? So responsibility has 2 parts, it turns out. The word means 2 things, and we use it both ways very frequently. We use the word responsibility to mean the thing that has to get done, but we also talk about the responsibility of the person who's supposed to do it, right? Who's responsible? So it turns out there's no responsibility when there's not a clear desired outcome. So if we say to the guys, we want you to manage the garbage from now on, and we don't talk about what the heck that means, we can't be too upset with them about not getting it done. The second thing is, if we are clear about who's supposed to do it, we can't be too upset about it not getting done. So a really good use of leadership says, okay, we're not going to ask anybody to take a job in the church where we aren't clear about 2 things. One is, what's supposed to happen because you've got this job? The most central job in the United Methodist Church description for a lay person is lay leader. I've been a pastor for 30 years. I have not yet once run into a lay leader who did not say to me, I don't really understand what's supposed to happen for this job. Right? As a matter of fact, you can do this sometime. Just start going around and asking people on committees, so what is your committee supposed to accomplish? What difference is it supposed to make? See how many people can talk about what the responsibility is. If they do have a responsibility, it probably is a task list, not an outcome, right? It's like, do the annual, you're the chair of the annual bazaar. Well, what's the annual bazaar supposed to do? Is it a fundraiser? Is it a chance for people in our congregation to celebrate their craftiness? Is it an opportunity for people in the neighborhood to get great Christmas decorations for cheap? Right? Because I've never been involved with a bazaar. By the way, I can tell this about any activity in the church where there wasn't arguments among people about you're charging too much, no, you're charging too little, or that stuff isn't good enough, or, right? I mean, because we aren't all clear even about what is it we're supposed to be doing here, making money, having fun, or serving our neighbor. And so different people have different ideas about what the responsibility is, but we never have actually been clear about it, right? And that's why the highest turnover job in my experience in the Methodist Church is chair of the annual bazaar. Because they're always in trouble with somebody for it not coming out the way it was supposed to. Okay, so who's responsible and what's the outcome? Churches that are vital and alive and fruitful get clear about responsibility with the people who are in charge. And by the way, if a committee is responsible, nobody's responsible. That's a law of nature. I'm not giving you advice, I'm telling you a basic fundamental truth. If there's a committee and the thing doesn't work, I guarantee you nobody will be in trouble if there's a committee. Right? By the way, if there's a committee and they're doing a great job, you will find that the committee chairperson has taken responsibility for making sure it happened and coordinated their work. But it's not because the whole committee was in charge. It's because somebody said, okay, look, this has to get done. Let's get in order here. So that's what we mean by responsibility. If you want to have effective life as a church, you won't ask anybody to do anything in the church where the responsibility isn't clear and who's responsible for that isn't clear. To them and to others. So, second thing is authority, though. You can say your job, Rashid, is to make sure that young families want to be in worship here. And it's very clear. We're going to tell Rashida, that's your job. And by the way, we'll be asking the DS for a different pastor if you're not good at getting young families in the church. Okay? No Methodist church has ever been that way about this, but just imagine that was the case. Okay, so Rashinda starts leading worship here, and after a while she goes, part of our problem is we don't have any projection, and younger generations are visual learners, and so we need a projector. And so somebody says, not in our sanctuary, right? I'll quote from my own experience as a pastor, I don't go to church to watch television, right? And if there's a projector in our church, I will be out of here with my money, right? One of our biggest churches in Portland is having a $3 million remodeling project, of which about $20,000 is to improve the technology in their sanctuary. That's the only controversial piece in the whole thing. Nobody's upset about spending $1.1 million renovating the steeple. There's all kinds of controversy about, whether they can put a projector in the sanctuary. Now, so what we're saying to Rashida is, the outcome we want is not young families, but you can't do what it would take for that to happen. Right? Churches do this all the time. They do it with the bazaar chair, and they do it with the youth group leader. We do it to each other, right? It's not just paid pastors. It's lots of us who have been asked to do certain things, right? We say you can do it, but you have to check with everybody else about how before you do anything, right? And especially if it's different than we did it last year. So we could be saying, for the last 20 years, we've been doing it this way, and we've been going downhill. We want you to change the course, but do it exactly the way we did it before. That's taking the authority away that's necessary to succeed in the responsibility. Right? So authority has to be aligned with responsibility. And what we mean by authority is not a big whip so that you can make people do things they don't want to do. What we mean is give this person the flexibility and the freedom in order to have the tools that they need to succeed at the responsibility that they have been given. You have to grant, if you're going to ask someone to be responsible, you have to give them at least the minimum that they will need to have some chance of succeeding. Most of our structures actually say you're responsible, you're the Sunday school teachers, and we want you to teach people how to be disciples. But there are 7 other committees who are not responsible for that have to approve of any change in the way you do that, like moving it to another day of the week, right? So we're not responsible for it, but we do get to tell you, no, you can't do it that way, okay? We typically take responsibility away. we need to give, authority away. We need to give the authority necessary to the people who have the responsibility. And I want to really highlight, I'm not just talking about pastors or paid staff. I'm talking about all of you who ever take on any responsibility in the church. We owe you the authority necessary to try and do it in a way that will actually succeed. And of course, you won't know what you need to succeed unless we've told you what success would be, right? So again, the rummage sale, what's the purpose of that? If it's a fundraiser, we need to give you the authority to set the prices and how good the stuff needs to be. If it's a fellowship event, then you don't need to make money, and we're not going to be mad if there is no profit at the end of the event, but we had a great time and everybody got to celebrate their gifts, right? You understand what I'm saying? Authority, responsibility have to be aligned. Now, why is it we always take authority away? The reason is that we've seen so many cases of someone being given a responsibility and an authority, and then they do stuff that makes us all look bad. So think of Jim Jones, who started a faith community, bought a country, practically half a country in Latin America, moved all his people there, and I said earlier, drank the Kool-Aid. That's where that phrase came from, right? He had authority. He had responsibility of leading a community of people. He did something horrible, right? And as a matter of fact, he was a pastor of the Disciples of Christ Church. I mentioned to you, for 2 years I went to a Disciples of Christ church. This happened while I was going to that church. And the people in that church is like, how come we haven't gotten him out, right? How come we did not excommunicate him as a Disciples of Christ leader? Well, it found out that the way the Disciples of Christ denomination worked, there wasn't any such thing. If you said, I want to be a Disciples of Christ pastor, you were. The convention had no processes for removing their name from somebody's movement, right? Guess what they did at their next general convention? They changed their constitution so that, no, actually, we have to say, yes, you're one of us, instead of you saying so. Because he made them look bad. So that's Jim Jones. How about Jimmy Swaggart? Heard of him? How about Jim Baker? Heard of him? Right? These are people who had responsibility and authority, but they made their whole movement look bad by subverting its integrity, right? So what we do is say, well, let's make sure they can't do anything until everybody votes okay. So we take the authority away. That's not actually the best way. Best way is never hire a pastor named Jim. Right? I can't tell you how often I've done this workshop. It turns out the pastor's name is Jim. That's all the time. No, actually what this is about is what we need is accountability. Right? When people are accountable, then they can have responsibility and authority, but they're accountable. That keeps us safe. And that matters. We do have the responsibility of shepherding the integrity of our movement. Right? We don't want people out there acting in ways that will be attributed to us that subvert our ability to carry out our mission. So effective congregations practice accountability. Remember I said authority is not giving somebody a big whip so they can make people do what they don't want to do. That's not what we mean by authority. It means giving adequate tools. Accountability is also not big whips for the most part. Mostly accountability is asking people, this was the responsibility, this is your authority. Now, is it happening? Are you doing what you said? Are we getting the outcome that we are seeking, right? The best accountability happens between peers, right? So this happens often with clergy who go to meet together and everybody says, all of you talk about is church. Yeah, that's because what we're doing is saying, how is it going with your ministry? And you're asking me about mine. I said, do you think of trying this if that's not working? And we're doing mutual accountability a lot of the times, at least at the best we are. Sometimes we're just seeing who can sound better than the next one, but we're people too. So effective leadership practices in a congregation are that we don't ask somebody to do something without being clear about what the responsibility is. The second thing is we give them the freedom and the tools that they need in order to have a chance to fulfill that responsibility. And finally, we hold them accountable. And we hold them accountable to two things, actually. One is the outcome that we're seeking, right? So if we say we hire a new youth leader, or somebody volunteers and we designated them as our youth leader, and they have a right to say to us, what do you want your youth group to do, right? And we might say something like, we want it to be twice as big in a year. We might say something like, we want our youth to want to be Jesus' people and be growing in that. There's any number of things we might say we want that to be. We should be clear about what that is. Because if what we want is people growing as Jesus' disciples, number may not matter. Right? If what we want is a group that's twice as big, well, let's be honest about that, and that's what we want you to do. Right? So accountability is to the outcomes that we entrusted to this person in the responsibility. The second thing that they're accountable to is our values as a community. So accountability is to our integrity as a community. It might also be a budget, right? We might say to the youth group ministry, you have a $2,000 a year budget for programming. Well, accountability is you got to stay within the budget. You can't just keep spending money until somebody says, whoa, it's gone, right? So those are the boundaries that we set in terms of accountability, so people know what the playing field is, how big is the yard that they're playing in to carry this out. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so what I'm really just trying to say to you is that accountability is around how do we make sure we're doing what we actually said we were going to do, and what are the results that we're looking for, and how do we know if we've done it in a way that matches our values. Really short, quick story. In 2001, I was in a church that built a new annex, a new building next to the existing facilities. It was about a $1.1 million project, and we needed to get pledges of $650,000 in order to start that project. So we hired a company, RSI, out of Texas, to help us with the fundraising. And they had a consultant come, and he met with our leadership team, and we had a 3-ring binder with how this all works, including all the committees that had to work, and we had a chair for each committee. The celebration dinner, the special gifts dinner, the Sunday morning speakers organizer, all these different pieces, the mailings, chair people for each of these committees. And so we all met with the consultant, and we said, now when are you going to speak to the whole congregation? He said, I'm not. You guys are doing that. I'm going to come every 3 weeks on Wednesday and meet with all the chair people and see if you're doing what the timetable says you'll get done by that point in time. And he did that for 3 months. He came every Wednesday. Every 3 weeks, he came on Wednesday. Every Sunday just before the Wednesday, I'm running around in the coffee hour to my chair people saying, are you ready for David to come? Are you ready for David to come? And here's what I heard again and again and again. Not quite, but I'm working on that this afternoon. And as near as I can tell, all the work for that whole campaign got done in the 3 days before he visited every 3 weeks, right? But at the end of the campaign, we raised more money than our goal. 3 years later, that pledge campaign is done. We still have a mortgage. We have another campaign. Guess what we said? Why would we spend $17,000 on a consultant? We've got the binder. We just did this 3 years ago. We know how to do it. We can do it ourselves. So we did. Well, we did about half of it. And we raised about half our goal. Because there was nobody coming to say, did you do what you said you would do by this Wednesday? That was it. There were no whips or chains. Nobody was threatened with excommunication. They just knew this guy was going to come from Texas and sit down with them on Wednesday and ask them, did you do what you said you would do? That was it. That's accountability. Okay? They knew clearly what they were supposed to get done, and they knew somebody was going to ask them if they had done it. That was it. And the difference was about $350,000 on a fundraising campaign. So effective churches do effective leadership practice. They pay attention in all the ways that they organize things to be clear about who the leader is, what the responsibility is, what authority they have been granted, and also who they're accountable to. And responsibility minus authority plus accountability is safe. That's the way we usually do it. You can we're asking you to do a job as long as you only do what was done last year and the year before and the year before. That'll be fine. But if you want to change anything, there's 6 committees that will have to approve that. Okay? And so that's the way we do it. It's safe, but it's not effective, especially in a changing environment where we need to do different things now than we did before. The second way to do it is responsibility plus authority minus accountability, and that's dangerous because the wrong people, either through being stupid or being bad, make us all look bad. And the best way is to keep those 3 things aligned. So we want a structural system that helps us to do that. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now let me talk about flat and simple, but before I do, any questions about responsibility, accountability, authority? That's really abstract, but it really works when you start getting concrete with it in your church. Yes?
Well, I got the responsibility and I got the authority. The accountability, how do you, so you have a finance committee, you have a finance chairman, and
Right.
you work through it. You plan effectively what you can do with, say, the monies that you have.
Right.
So that's being accountable, or do you
Good
have
question.
to do something else?
Well, let's use the finance committee as an example then. And it's an example, it's a good one because it highlights how we don't do this very well. So most of our finance committees in churches have these responsibilities. Number 1, to set policy. Like there will be an annual audit. The council gets these reports. The finance committee decides that, right? So one responsibility is policy. Second responsibility is doing their own policy, right? Doing the reports, having 2 people to count all the money and put in all that kind of stuff. So they make the rules, then they're also the people who are supposed to follow the rules. I'll tell you right there, that's not accountability, right? Because if we made the policy, we can ignore it. And we do. I've been in dozens and dozens of Methodist churches that will tell you immediately they know what they're supposed to do with the money, but they're not necessarily actually doing it because we just didn't have somebody who could this week or whatever. We excuse ourselves really easy. So the second thing is they have a responsibility to do according to the policy. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is most finance committees are also supposed to raise the money. Right? They're also the stewardship committee. So they have confusing responsibilities, for one thing. And I've been on finance committees, as I mentioned, ever since I was 15 years old. And if we're responsible for raising the money and also responsible for writing the checks, I can tell you what we do. When we don't want to work harder to raise money, we say there isn't any, stop spending it. Right? So we have this conflict of responsibility. That's completely different than a ministry team. That's the annual pledge campaign. And they have a responsibility to raise X amount of money. That's been given to them by the church council. And they're going to work on that. They're going to succeed or they're not going to. They're going to give it their best shot. And we're not going to beat them up, but we're going to say, that's your job. Work at that. And that's it, right? But here's the policies we've already set around that. Here's the boundaries we have around that. We're not going to go door to door or whatever those policies might be. These are not the things we do. I've been in churches that don't do an annual pledge campaign. Mostly farm churches that don't do an annual pledge campaign.
Oh, do they make a budget?
They make a budget, but they don't do a pledge campaign because they're farm churches and all the I've been in 2 churches that were 80% farmers and they say, we can't make a pledge. We don't know until the crop comes in what we're going to make. What we do know is we'll give generously when the crop comes in unless there's no money, right? And so they tended to look at last year's income and budget next year based on what they had, right? So I'm saying there's different ways to do that, but it doesn't work when the same people are all 3 parts of that responsibility. So accountability is really just about 2 things. One is, what's the outcome that is supposed to happen. Is that happening? The hardest part of that is not the accountability part. The hardest part is getting clear about what we want to happen. Because we're really used to what do we want to happen at the annual bazaar? We want the annual bazaar to happen. What do we want to happen in worship? Well, we want there to be worship every week. That's not an outcome, right? That's just a check box. Too often we just say, we just want to what we've always done to happen again. As a matter of fact, we'll strain ourselves to death trying to make sure we keep doing what we've done before, even when it's been 30 years since it actually worked, right? So accountability only works when we get clear about the responsibility. What do we want to happen because we did this? Then accountability is actually easy. Did that happen or not? And it's not punitive. It's, well, no, it didn't happen. Well, then what do we learn from that? Maybe we need to do it differently or whatever. So it is difficult. You have to start with the simplest, clearest circumstances and grow your ability to do that. I don't know if that answers, but it gets easier the more specific the examples are, right? So if you, and again, when it's not committees, when it's individual leaders. Other thought, questions, responses?
Well, you said there were two things.
Oh, okay, thank you. Accountability is number one to the outcome. Number two is to our values, right? To the boundaries that we have set. So we could say to a youth group, you can raise money any way you want as long as it doesn't offend the dignity of the people who are doing it. I used to do dean camps a lot in our camping program, especially with 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, that age, that late elementary age. And, you know, some camps will have a big chart on the wall with 25 rules. You know, don't throw rocks, don't throw sticks, don't run barefoot, whatever. Never works with 4th graders. Because for one thing, if it says don't throw rocks, they'll go, how about pine cones, right? Wasn't on the list. No. So in my camps, we said we only have 3 rules: respect one another, respect the environment, respect our, what we're doing together. And 4th graders, when they were acting badly, we could say, is that respectful to one another? They would tell us, no. They know that, right? So that's the kind of value, that's the values. Values are way more powerful than rules, which is why Jesus said, let's don't have all the rules, let's have some values. Okay? So accountability is to our values and to what's the outcome that we are asking you to accomplish. It turns out that organizations that are flat and simple do that better. And they're also better at some other things. So let me talk about flat and simple. They're 2 different things. But flat and simple both relate to these questions. How do we make decisions? How do we set our direction as a community of people? And how do we allocate our resources? Flat and simple organizations are flat and simple in the way that they do those things. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. And so some ways you can tell if it's flat and simple is it easy for everybody to know who to ask? If I want to know if something is okay or not, is it easy for me to know who to ask? Remember that church structure I showed you? Not easy to figure out who to ask, right? What is our mission? So in a flat and simple organization, if somebody's new here and they come and sit down and they go, is it easy for them to figure out why are we here? Why are these people here? What are they doing and why are they doing it? In a flat and simple organization, it's easy to know what our values are. Those are apparent and they're explicit. One of the problems that a lot of our long time, actually this is true of any organization that lasts a long time, not just churches, but if they last a long time, lots and lots of our values go underground, right? So we say, all are welcome here, and then I come in Bermuda shorts and somebody says, it'd really be nice if you dressed up a little bit more, right? Because it turned out we had a value that isn't on the list, but turns out to be important. And it's like I say often have said, going to visit a church is kind of like going to someone else's family reunion. You know, and you sit down at the picnic table with the chicken and somebody says, oh, I noticed Aunt Janice isn't here, and everybody laughs and you go, I have no idea what that was about, but they all know, right? People who've been together a long time have all kinds of stuff that they don't even need to, they have code languages, right? And I'm not talking about SPRs, I'm not talking about acronyms, I'm talking about they know all kinds of things about each other that they just barely refer to and everybody knows a whole lot of stuff, right? It's one of the reasons that so many people find it easier to join a church that's new than the one that's around, because everybody's talking about what they share, because they don't know yet, right? But in an organization that's been around a long time, it's all underground, it's all silent, and Rashinda and I, any of us who are Methodist pastors move around. Now it takes at least 3 years to even begin to figure out what's going on in a church. And not because people are being secretive, it's just that they all know and assume everybody else knows the same stuff, but they know. So who manages the finances and the facilities? Who actually makes the decisions? And by the way, I've served 7 different Methodist churches and was a layperson in 2. And I can tell you that in most churches, I don't care what anybody says, it's not the finance committee that decides how the money is spent. There's 3 or 4 people that have a conversation in the parking lot. That's where it happens. Right? I served one little rural church where everybody even joked about the kitchen committee. You had all the committees and the committees met, but really it was the 5 people in the kitchen while the meeting was going on. That's where the real decisions were made. Right? That's not flat and simple because new people they go, what? I've been in many circumstances where the whole committee structure, the education committee decided, then the youth council decided, then the education committee, then the church council and the trustees, and then it didn't happen because somewhere else in the church was somebody who said, not on my watch. So imagine you're new, and you get an idea, and you go to the committees, and they all pass it, and it all says yes, and then you start doing it, and you're in trouble. That happens all the time. That's not flat and simple, right? Because in a flat and simple organization, the decisions are made in a way that people can know how that happened and who makes it. How do I get involved and what is there to be involved in? Flat and simple organizations, those are all clear. So let me highlight that a little bit. That chart is not a flat organization. Okay? I can't get between the projector and the light. Way on the right-hand end, I'll start at the left-hand end. This is an all-church meeting, which you might call it your all-church conference, right? The annual meeting when the DS comes. Then the next box says church council. Do you have one? Church council. Then under the church council, there are some committees, elected committees. Trustees, finance, staff parish relations. You might have an education committee, a worship committee, a mission and outreach committee, right? Some of those kinds of things. When I was growing up at Monteville United Methodist Church, there were 17 elected committees. And those were all on the discipline, right? Yeah.
We couldn't have that many. We don't have that many.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Right. Not very many of our churches have 17 anymore. They're down to only 5 or 6, right? So I bet you have a church council. I bet you have trustees. I bet you have finance committee. Do you have any program committees that are elected people?
We have a lot of teams.
Not so much.
More
teams, right? And we're going to talk about teams. Teams are really important and valuable. So then below the middle one in there, it goes all church meeting, church council, education. Then under education, there's 3 other committees. By the way, this is an actual church I served. Underneath the education committee was the youth council, which was the kids and adults who led the youth fellowship program. There was the annual mission trip group, and there was the children's Sunday school team, right? So there were 3 teams, all of which their activities and so on were coordinated, managed by the education committee. And then under the youth fellowship, I got that wrong. Children's ministry, adult ministry, youth ministry. Under the youth ministry was the youth fellowship, Sunday night fellowship, The youth mission trip and the confirmation class were managed by the youth council. So the mission trip, annual mission trip, had been doing a spaghetti dinner for decades to raise money for the trip, but it was getting problematic. All the kids didn't show up to work on it. There were arguments about whether the kids who didn't work on the spaghetti dinner should get a share in the money that was raised. All that stuff was getting harder. Plus, people were tired of going to the spaghetti dinner every year, and it was getting, had run its course, kind of old hat. So one of the kids out there on the mission planning team, who starts meeting in November to plan the March trip, said, I have some friends in a church in Portland that sell stock. Instead of doing a fundraiser, they sell stock for $15 a share, and all the kids who are going sell stock to their aunts and uncles and cousins and next door neighbors, and that's how they raise the money. There's no dinner to do or anything like that. And then, while we're on the trip, we make a video of the trip, we set it to music, and after we get back from the trip, we invite all the shareholders to come to a potluck dessert. And we show them the movie, and kids share how the experience of the mission trip affected them. So the youth council said, great idea. The mission group said, great idea. They took it to the youth council at their next monthly meeting in December. Okay? The youth council said, that's a great idea. Let's run that by the education committee. So the January education committee met, said, that sounds like a terrific idea. Want to take it to the church council. Is this sounding familiar? This is a real story, not made up. They took it to the church council. The church council said, sounds like a good idea to us, but I think we should run this past the finance committee and the mission and ministry committee to make sure it doesn't mess up any of our other things that are going on. So that went from the February church council meeting, went out to the March meetings of the other committees, came back to the church council in May, and they said, go ahead, 2 months after the trip. Right? So the next year, they went to selling stock instead of spaghetti dinner.
Well, don't Methodists have to have a method?
Yes, they do.
I sent Steve a chart. I tried to chart out what we were doing here. He's laughing. Even by email, I could hear he dropped everything and his jaw dropped. I got this email back that, like, what are you sending me? And what even is that? And what are you doing? But it was so convoluted, just trying to explain. I was just trying to make it simple for new people, and it ended up looking like a disaster movie if you never wanted anybody to get out alive.
If you try to chart most churches' decision-making structure, the actual one, right? So you put up there all the groups that have, and then you start doing solid arrows for direct accountability and dotted lines for what they consult here. That's what you end up with. This spaghetti mess. And the thing is that if you're a new person, that's the real deal, right? So yeah, I emailed Rashinda back and I said some things are not worth clarifying, right? Just. That's probably a real description, but it's not going to help anybody. So flat means how many steps is it from the edge to the middle? Okay, I want to use that language because this is important. Where's your mission field? It's at the edge, right? Your mission field is at the edge of your community, of your church community. As soon as you step out of your church community, out of your usness, you are in your mission field. That's where the mission field is. It's at the edge, right? So if it's from your all-church annual meeting to the kids who are inviting friends to the mission trip, if that's 7 steps of decision layers, your middle will not know what's going on in your mission field. And the people out there who do know, the kids who are going on the mission trip and saying, I can't get my friends to come work at the spaghetti dinner because they don't even know they want to go to church here yet, but I could get them to sell shares to their friends so they can go, right? That awareness of the mission field can't get to the center fast enough to be responsive. So a flat organization makes as few steps as it can manage to have from the middle of the organization, from the middle of the church, the center of the church, to the edge. That's what flat means. So here's a flatter organization. And the structure that I'm going to talk about after the break is patterned on this structure. So what we have here is an all-church meeting over at the left end, your annual all-church conference. And we'll talk about that all-church meeting and what it should be about. And then you have your church council, which functions year-round, right? Not just once a year. And then the next box is the pastor. And then all of those red boxes, and by the way, those are just illustrative. Every activity or ministry or function that the church has will have a ministry team. The ministry team is who are the people who actually do that, right? So there's an annual mission trip. It's the people who organize and lead that and all the people who go on it. If there's an annual this is something that used to happen in Monteville when I was growing up. 4 weeks inland, they had a Wednesday night dinner and they brought in missionaries and talked about mission. It was called the Annual Mission Series, right? And there were some people who planned those dinners, invited the missionaries. They did that 4 times every year, 4 Wednesday nights in a row during Lent. That would be the annual mission dinner team. And that would be all the people who organize and plan that event. You might have a Sunday morning children's program mission team, right? You might also have a vacation Bible school mission team. You don't have an education committee that's in charge of all educational activities. You have ministry teams that are the people who are invested in doing that ministry. And each of those ministry teams has a leader. And those leaders are accountable to, they're accountable to the mission of the church, but through the coordinating function of the pastor. Now, why do we put the pastor in that role? I have lots of churches say, well, does that have to be the pastor? And the answer is yes. And here's why. I know I'm not going to ask you the question, I'm going to give you the question is, if you're new and you come to church and visit on a Sunday, who are you going to ask if you have a question? The pastor. Remember I said it should be easy to know who do you ask? That's why it has to be the pastor.
I thought that was so until several years back, and I asked the question of the pastor, and she said, that's not my area.
Correct. Well, that's because in our structures, we tell pastors, you're not actually in charge, right? In our existing structures, if it's a question about Christian education, then it's the education committee that you have to ask. If it's a question about a use of a space in the building, then it's the trustees you have to
I was
ask.
just asking about large envelopes.
Well, there you go. Right? So she probably, or he probably meant, well, that's the finance committee. I don't know about that, right? And so, this is testimony of 30 years as a local pastor told that's not your department, right? I got in trouble more often for answering questions because the right committee didn't decide it, right, than I ever did for not answering questions. As long as pastors say, I don't know, they're usually not in trouble except with the person they say. But if you do know, then there's a committee or somebody who feels that you have intruded on their responsibility and their autonomy. So this just says that the pastor is the alignment person for all those ministries. And the pastor does that because the pastor has worked with the council to be clear about what are our values and how do we do things around here and so on. The pastor might also say, for example, on the stock sale thing, right? This actually happened to me. Can we do that? My answer to them on Sunday morning after church was, oh, that sounds like a good idea, but I need to talk to some other people and I'll get back to you within a week, which I did, right? I talked to some people on the council, I talked to some of the finance people and some of the mission people, right? Some of those other mission team people who would have a stake in it. They're thinking of doing this, what do you think of that? And I had 5 or 6 conversations and I went back and said, that's a great idea, go ahead. It took less than a week because I was put in the position by the church of saying, your job is to coordinate and align our ministries so that they don't trip over each other and so that our mission gets carried out, right? And my job was to know, when do I already know the answer and I can give it, and when do I don't know the answer, I need to consult. Yeah?
And I know this is probably maybe a little bit silly, but how do you then stop the pastor from having to be the bad guy?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that's my only thought process, is look at all these things going through the pastor, and especially in a church like ours where there has needed to be healing over several years, like, how do you make the person who has helped heal the church not then become the bad person who says no, or, you know what I mean?
I absolutely do.
Logistically, that seems a little
Yeah. So
terrifying to be this person.
So, and actually, you're asking a question that's it's a specific application of a bigger principle,
Sure.
which is that we think accountability is always going to be oppressive or hurtful.
Sure.
And what I can tell you is that I was able to say no sometimes without, almost never when I said no was it horrible for the person, right? Let me just contrast it. So what I could do is, tell me your name. Vicky comes to me and says, I have a great new idea for a bake sale after church every week to raise money for mission. I'm just making it up, Vicky. And I say to her, wow, I love the idea of making money for mission. Let's think about, the traffic jam and every week something being for sale in the narthex. Let's talk about that a little bit. Is that going to feel good to everybody? Let's talk about maybe some other way we could do that would not intrude so much on the social hour, but enable us to raise money, right? And Vicki and I it's not just no, right?
Dialogue.
It's how can we, let's work with that idea till it's really a good one for us, right? And I did that. Yeah, right. Right?
Yeah.
So, and that's different than her asking me about that and saying, well, let's run that by the finance committee, and she doesn't get to go to the finance committee meeting. Right? Later, she just hears from me, they said no. Right? We think there'll be a lot of bad feelings about no, because most often when we say no, it comes from who knows where. Yeah, it's not a coaching reality. So it's a legitimate question. What I'm saying is in actual practice. Now, here's the caveat. There are pastors in the Methodist system, I'm sure this doesn't happen in any other systems, but who are so bad at the work that they make all kinds of people mad. It's not because of this, it's because we have the wrong person in leadership, right? By the way, this is the hard news. It's not only pastors, sometimes it's lay people. Rashinda talked a little bit today about church bullies, right? And there have been people that as a pastor I had to wangle out of leadership because everything they touched shriveled up and died. They were good workers, not good leaders, right? And so it turns out leadership is actually, it matters, and you need to have the people who are doing it well do it, and the people who are better at doing other things do those better, because it's not just about leadership, right?
I would say too that when the lines of authority are clear, there's much less problem with being able to say, wow, let's talk about that idea, or gosh, I don't think that'll worry about it. So when we can straight talk to each other, instead of worrying about who's going to feel part of this decision that may or may not feel included, and how is that going to work, that's when it gets very complicated.
We had a kind of a conflicted example in McMinnville, one that, I'll tell you what I mean by conflicted. 38 people signed a petition to get rid of me, okay, as the pastor. And here was the deal. We had 2 worship services and had for some time, one traditional, one more contemporary. They were both in the sanctuary. The contemporary, quote, service, we called it celebration service, had, microphones and wires and all kinds of stuff. And that all had to be put up and then torn all down quick between the celebration service and the traditional service every week. Then we built this new building, the annex, which had a big great room in it, kitchen, big social hall. But we had actually intentionally built the building because the original plan eventually was to demolish the old sanctuary and build a new one, so that while that was happening, we could have worship in there. It wasn't really a worship space, but at least it would work for that. And so as soon as that building was built, everybody who was in the celebration service said, man, we should be in that. That's so much better. The screen is big, the lighting is better, it's chairs instead of pews, everything about it fits better. So we said, great idea, let's do that. 38 people signed a petition to get rid of me. there was an uprising from the traditional service people. None of the people who even went to that service, right? So fortunately, I had a superintendent who said, well, no, you don't, I mean, this is a good idea, right? And so we did about a month of process with people, but an awful lot of that was saying to people in the traditional service, why are you saying no to somebody else in the church when this doesn't affect you, right? We had to say back to them, no, we're not going to ask you if it's okay if that congregation worships over there, because it's not your decision which room they use. You understand what I'm saying? Now, it wasn't easy. We did work through it. By the way, we didn't lose any members. This is because I just love this. I don't love it, but I mean, it's just so to get this part. 9 of the people on that list were in nursing homes. So whoever was stirring that up went around to nursing homes and upset a lot of shut-ins, right, just to get their point across. So, which is just to say, not everybody in a church is always motivated by their best side. By the way, most of those people are good people, but they were all scared and wound up and got a bad vibe going in among them. And,
Can I ask a second
and as I say, none of them ended up leaving the church. And by the way, as a matter of fact, I got to tell you this part of the story too. About 6 months later, several people in that traditional service were in a Sunday school class called the Episcopals, and we gave them the best room in the new building for their Sunday school class. And it was on the 2nd floor, and the great room was 2 floors, so it'd be like, imagine in that wall, a great big window, and up there is where those Sunday school rooms are, but that's a hallway. And I'm standing serving communion to 180 people, young families, children, and I'm serving communion, and I look up, and there's the Episcopals class standing in that window going, all happy. These are the people who signed the petition, right? So 6 months later, when they see the consequence, the growth and the vitality that's coming out of that window, they loved it. Then they're telling their friends, look what we've done, right? But they had to see the results, because all they were feeling was loss. Honestly, here was their objection. We won't see all those people if they're not in our building when we come to church, right? If they're in the other building. They were afraid of loss, and they couldn't see gain until later they saw the gain. Okay, so you understand flat? If you say if all the steps had to be used to say yes, how many would there be? And you want to keep that as small as you can. Does that make sense? And you understand why? Okay. For one thing, it helps you put authority where the responsibility is, right? The authority is closer to the responsibility. The mission trip people have a better chance of deciding how they can do that well than if there's way too many steps. It's about aligning authority with the responsibility. Let me just say one more thing about simple. You can have a really flat organization. I've served little country churches that had one committee, church council, that's it. The first church I served, the church council met every first Sunday of the month, potluck after church. Everybody stayed, right? You'd think it would be a really simple structure because it couldn't be flatter. Everybody's on the church council and it meets once a month in a potluck. But no decisions were ever made there. All the decisions were made behind the scenes, right? You could have a vote in the church council to do something that wouldn't necessarily happen. You could have a vote not to do something that would happen anyway. Because the real decision-making structure didn't have anything to do with church council. It had to do with the matriarchs and patriarchs and the influencers of the church, not the pastor, by the way, because pastors came and went. So that's not simple. It's very flat, but not simple. So you get some sense of it's simple if the way we say we do things is actually do things, right? That's really important. So I was in one church where the youth room was full of the pews from the old church building. They couldn't bear to get rid of the pews when they sold the old church building, so they put all of the pews from the old building. By the way, they also weren't good enough for the new sanctuary. So they put them in the youth room in the basement, which was so full of pews that you could hardly get your knees in between. And so we started growing a youth group. The youth group wanted to use their room. The youth group went to the education committee. Can we get rid of those pews? Sure, that's ridiculous. By the way, it said youth room chapel over the door down there. In the basement, no windows. Low ceiling, beautiful chapel. So the education committee said sure, the church council said sure, the trustees said sure, so the church decided to, or the, this process decided to give those pews to the Union Gospel Mission because they had a chapel and no seats. And we put in the newsletter that that was going to be happening, and immediately had a visit from the patriarchs of the church saying, you can't do that. We'll pull our money out if you get rid of those pews. That's not simple. So we worked through that, and ultimately we were able to do it by offering everybody in the church who wanted to take a pew home. They could have as many as they wanted. And one person took one pew, and then we gave the rest of them to the Union Gospel Mission. But simple means the way you make decisions is actually the way you say you make decisions. So if there is a committee or a leader who's responsible for something, the rest of the church doesn't say, you can't do that. Right? This is a very hard lesson for our churches because we have taught each other over the past 50 years that even if my church has decided to do this, I'm still free to walk around and tell everybody who's doing it how awful I think it is that they are. Have you ever seen that happen? Right? And here's the deal. If we've been around for 30 years, to me, that's background noise. I know that Ed's always going to complain about everything, and I don't go, in one ear, out the other. But new people, they don't. Right? We went through the process. The decision was made. They said, yes, we could do this program, and now I'm standing in the social hall, and one of the people who really belongs here came up and said, I just can't stand that they're doing this. Right? That's horrible for new people, right? So part of the thing of getting simple is we have to start talking to each other about, look, we made that decision. You cannot go around and tell the people doing it now that they shouldn't be, because that hurts. And it's not honest. This is, all of us don't get to decide what everybody here has to do. Together we have to make some common decisions, and then we live with them. It's not all about me, right? So simple has to do with that. Do we really make decisions the way we say we do? So that's flat and simple, and that means I'm ready to start talking about, okay, how do you actually have a structure that helps do that? But let's take a break, okay? 10 minutes.